Yeah. Okay. Okay. So here we go. So I am so excited because, as Rachel said, my first novel, my debut novel, just launched a couple of days ago. And it's even hard for me to wrap my head around the fact that I've actually written a novel, even though I wanted to write a book my entire life. Um, and even wishing I had written a book, I never expected The Crate to be the first book that I ended up writing, because The Crate is a story of a really grisly murder that involved my family. And as I was writing the story of this crime, I realized that for readers to really understand the impacts that this crime had on my family, they had to know the context of where we all came from, and especially my parents. My parents were impacted probably more than any of us. And so for people to understand why, I had to write a bit about their history. So let me start from the beginning. Both my parents are from Hungary. My mother was born in Budapest, which you can see here in the middle of the country. And about 2 hours north of Budapest is a little village named Balasagyarmat, and that's where my father was born. And both my mom and dad had very nice, very wholesome childhoods, very pleasant childhoods, until they didn't. And fast forward to 1956, they both escaped Hungary together on foot to Austria, and eventually made their way over to North America. But let me show you a few pictures of Hungary. So these are some of my favorite places. There are several bridges across the Danube. If any of you have been there, this is, really magical nighttime scene. The architecture, like the Parliament buildings, is spectacular, very Gothic, very intricate. And this is also one of my favorite places in Budapest. It's called the New York Cafe, and it is so ornate, as you can see in this picture. It's one of the last remaining great coffee houses of Europe. And so I was there a couple of times, and what really struck me about Hungary, and it's a beautiful country, but what struck me about it is that people who are capable of surrounding themselves with such beauty are also capable of such ugliness. So, as I said, 1956, my parents escaped communist Hungary, escaped the Hungarian Revolution on foot to Austria, and eventually were able to board the Empress of Britain on its inaugural voyage to North America. And they landed in New Brunswick, which is, you probably know, one of the maritime provinces of Canada. And from there, they made their way west to Toronto. And so I was born in Toronto, a little bit later than this picture. So my parents, came to Canada. They were so grateful to be in North America. They were so grateful to leave persecution behind in Europe. And they came with my brother when he was 3 years old. And this is my parents getting their residency cards. So this was about 1961, a few years after they arrived. And then I was born a few years later, and grew up in this house in Toronto. It was a very quiet house. It was an immaculate house where I felt like I had to walk on eggshells because my parents seemed so fragile. I felt like I couldn't be disrespectful in any way, or I definitely could not talk back or get angry, because I felt like my parents could shatter at any moment. And our family seems so different from all the other families in the neighborhood, from our neighbors on both sides. all the kids that I grew up with seemed to be living in these families with brothers and sisters and aunts and uncles and cousins, and they would have these big backyard birthday parties and sleepovers with tons of relatives, popping by. And in my family, it was just my two parents, my one older brother, and one grandmother. And it felt to me like we were this island of 5 people living in a sea of Canadians who belonged there, and we did not belong. And for many reasons. First of all, I did not speak English. None of us spoke English. We spoke Hungarian. And so when I started kindergarten, I didn't know a word of English. And in fact, I got teased for not being able to read English, even though I was reading Hungarian fluently. And these were a couple of my childhood books. But I was really teased for not even knowing the English alphabet by the time I started school. So that was definitely one obstacle. And then, oops, what happened here? There we go. The food. So this is what I wanted to be eating, like the other kids. And instead, this is the kind of stuff that my mother would cook. And this is what she would serve when I had friends come over for dinner, which you can imagine did not go over that well. So not because my mother was a bad cook. In fact, she was a fantastic cook. But to make a big vat of some kind of mushy stew was very economical. And we didn't have any money when I was a little kid. And so my mother would make, enough of one of these mushy stews to last 4 or 5 dinners in a row. And these 2 particular dishes are probably the things that I hated the most. On the left is a dish called kocsonyás hal, which is fish in aspic or jello. And on the right, kell kapusta főzelék, which is like a mush of cabbage and bacon and very unappetizing to look at, and I couldn't stand it. But sometimes my mother did break out and make some more palatable stuff, paprikás csirke, or chicken paprikás you've probably heard of. And on the right, tilted kapusta, or stuffed cabbage, which was better. And when we were having company, then she would pull out all the stops and make the really good stuff like strudel, or if you've ever been to a European bakery, maybe they have them in Hartford. They don't have them down here in Trumbull, but dobosh on the right. And some of my absolute favorite things on the left is a dish called gesztenye puree, which is a chestnut puree of chestnuts mixed with rum and sugar and pushed through a potato ricer to make these long strands. And then on the right, crepes, usually filled with chocolate or cheese or apricot filling. And rum balls, also something my mom saved for the very best occasions. And then on the right, plum dumplings, an absolute delicacy in the summer. It's plums inside these very heavy potato dough dumplings, delicious. And then the other thing that separated me from the other kids was how she dressed me. So my mother insisted on dressing me in these very old-fashioned, thick, ugly Hungarian traditional clothes that were built to last forever and looked absolutely nothing like what the other kids were wearing. And so, I really felt like a stranger in a strange land. And the more of an outcast I felt, the more I spent time in libraries and the more I read books. And so the characters from books became my best friends growing up. And I'm quite sure that that has a lot to do with how I became a writer. I've been a lifelong writer since college. I've been doing journalism and public relations, which is writing, different kind of writing. It's mostly ghostwriting, telling other people's stories. Anyway, we settled into Canadian life. The years went by, and by the early 1970s, my parents really wanted what they saw other people doing in Toronto, and it seemed like every household around us was doing this, and that was building or buying a cottage, a lake house north of Toronto in the countryside, a place to escape the hot summers and go on the weekends. And this was the cottage country dream. They wanted to have a cottage on a lake, especially in this region of Ontario called Muskoka. And if you can imagine the most pristine, forested land filled with about 1,600 lakes, ringed with cottages and dotted with islands. It's an absolutely spectacular place. And so in the 1970s, my parents had worked extremely hard. They scrimped and saved. And eventually they were able to get themselves a little piece of land on a lake in Muskoka and start building a cottage. And so the first structure to go up, of course, was the outhouse in 1972. And then, morphing over time, what started as a very small cottage, eventually we added on little bits and, decks here and little eating areas there. And so by 1984, the cottage had sort of morphed into this. And here are just a couple of iconic pictures of the lake. And the 1980s, that's my brother, Peter, who's 11 years older than me. And here another just pretty picture of sunrise over the lake. And this one is important because here you can see how steeply the land slopes down towards the water. And what happened is it left sort of this angled crawl space between the ground and the floor of the cottage. So all of this is context for the crime that happened to our family. And this is actually the crawl space. It figures prominently. But by 2010 now, so we're fast forwarding again, I happened to be in Florida with my family for a baseball tournament. My son was playing ball, and I got a phone call from my brother, and he said a wooden crate had been discovered in that crawl space between the floor and the ground. It was shoved up really tight, and he didn't recognize it as belonging to him. And so he pulled it out from under there, and it was nailed very tightly shut. And when the crate was finally opened, it was the most gruesome thing that you could ever imagine. And this crime, it really rocked my family. So first of all, I had 3 young children that I wanted to shield from the whole situation. And my husband and I were totally freaked out. This is Detective Dave Allen of the OPP. OPP stands for Ontario Provincial Police. He's retired now, but he actually led the investigation. And as part of the investigation, Dave Allen named my brother Peter as the primary murder suspect. So this entire situation turned my family upside down, and especially my elderly parents. This is an OPP photo. What follows are a bunch of OPP photos. This is the actual crate the night that it was opened. And here you can see they've started to cordon off our property as a crime scene. And the following morning, they continued investigating, and they must have used miles of crime scene tape to cordon off our entire property in the woods. And the whole situation was terrifying. We felt violated because, for my family and especially for my parents, this cottage was their safe haven. It was their refuge, and it was the one place, the one the one thing that they owned that no one could take away from them. They had built it by hand with their blood and their sweat. And, to have something so violent defile what they considered their refuge was very traumatic for them. This is another OPP photo. It just sort of details the difference in the cottage over the years before and after a renovation. And here are some of the characters that figured prominently into the story. This is an example of Dave Allen's humor, his sense of humor. This was actually one of his favorite clues. He was able to match a piece of tie-par paper. That's the lining that they put on the side of a house before the siding goes up. And he was able to match a piece of the tie-par that lined the crate with the piece that was actually missing from that one window. So he was very proud of that clue. And here's another example of his humor. You see Columbo, and on the right, the face of a murderer. So the story was splashed all over the media. The television crews showed up on our very private property. The story of the murder and the investigation made it into all the headlines, coast to coast in Canada. And it really was a very tragic story of a very undeserved, well, no one deserves to be murdered, especially not like that. But this happened to be a very tragic story of a young victim. And so, and here it is in a feature story in a very big glossy magazine in Toronto. So, as you can imagine, the violence and the horror of this whole situation really dredged up my parents' memories of everything that they'd experienced in the Holocaust, and really, shocked them, because at their age, they were in their 80s when this happened, and they never expected to have to confront this kind of evil in their lives again. They thought that they'd put all that human evil and violence and horror behind them. And then here it was again in the present, in the one place that they felt the safest. And if anyone has been to Hungary, you'll recognize this as a memorial to victims of the Holocaust, commemorating the times when Nazis forced Jews to take off their shoes and clothes and jump into the Danube and be shot and killed in other ways here on the banks of the Danube. So the mouse and cherry blossom, this slide I'd like to come back to if there's time at the end of the presentation. So I'll remember to come back to that, but I want to fast forward a couple more years. So now, so as I said, I wrote the story of the murder, the investigation, the trial, and the verdict here in the crate. And the verdict was actually given in 2013. And then about 2 years later, maybe 3, I was working as a publicist here in Connecticut, and a number of these lawsuits came to my attention. There were all of these middle-aged men coming forward to accuse their very elite private schools of abuse dating back to the 1980s. And I read through some of the complaints, and I'm telling you, I could not believe what these young boys had been through. They were so vulnerable. They were preyed upon. They found themselves in these sort of isolated private school campuses where everyone from the board of directors on down to the janitor, everyone knew what was going on. Everyone was complicit. Nobody reported these crimes against these boys. No one protected them in any way. And, I just thought that this was such an important story to tell in a fictionalized way. And so I started doing research, and I found that, the cases of private school abuse are not limited to Connecticut by any means. These were just some of the cases that I looked into. So you can see, New England, and then around North America, and up to, Dublin and England, Sydney, Australia. And just this past summer, there was a case in Denmark. The Crown Prince and Crown Princess of Denmark pulled their 16-year-old son, Prince Christian, out of his very prestigious private school amid all of these allegations of abuse. And again, it was a case where the leadership just turned a blind eye, and the students there described all sorts of examples of bullying and physical and sexual abuse. So this is not a story from the 1980s. It's a story that's very timely, unfortunately, to this day. And so I wrote the book, A Nest of Snakes, and it just came out, as Rachel mentioned. It just launched a couple of days ago. And so I'm very excited that so far the reviews have been really good. People seem to like the book, which makes me so happy. And I just want you to meet the protagonist, Brendan Cortland. So at least I can wish that this is eventually going to be the Brendan Cortland in the movie version. A girl can dream. Brendan, when we meet him at the beginning of the story, is a really broken man. He is showing all kinds of signs of PTSD. He has nightmares and chronic depression and agoraphobia. And he's really barricaded himself in this mansion in Connecticut. And he's been there for many, many years. The only people that he has contact with outside, the walls of his mansion are his psychiatrist, who he sees once a week, and really his housekeeper and her son. And in all of these years of being isolated, Brendan has developed these fantastic computer skills, and he uses that to check into these very clandestine chat rooms where he hunts pedophiles. So we know right off the bat that Brendan was abused as a young boy. And later in the story, Brendan decides to launch a lawsuit and testify, even though his lawyer has warned him that testifying could really dredge up all the memories of what he went through as a boy and really re-traumatize him. And so I go through, a little bit of the past, a little bit of the present, back and forth, his private school days up to the present, and preparing for his lawsuit. And I just want to, make a note about the title. So the title was no accident, because back when I was researching these complaints and reading about these Connecticut lawsuits, and the media again had covered these cases very extensively, and the New York Daily News ran a big story about a Connecticut lawsuit, and the headline was "A Nest of Pedophiles." And then later, as I was just finishing writing, so a couple of years ago, there was a Trump aide who referred to the White House as a nest of vipers. You might remember hearing that in the news. He called it a nest of vipers. And I just thought that imagery was so powerful. And then, of course, Freud has a lot to say about snakes being phallic images. So I thought A Nest of Snakes would be a very appropriate title for the book. But there are no actual snakes in the story. I know some people are squeamish just looking at, picture of a snake, even though I think this one is kind of beautiful, even looking at the book cover of my book, but there are no actual snakes beyond what Brendan imagines. So the book is out, and it's funny, as I was writing this book, it really occurred to me that there are a lot of themes that overlap with my first book. So dredging up memories, for sure, the evil that people are capable of, and trauma from the past, how trauma from when we're children can impact us so greatly when we're adults. And yesterday was World Trauma Day, so I think this is a very apropos discussion for today about people still dealing with trauma in their lives and mental health issues and so on. And as a child of Holocaust survivors, I can certainly attest to how much childhood trauma still figures in many people's lives. So I just want to go back to that slide for a second. If you remember the picture of the mouse with the cherry blossoms. Rachel, how am I doing with time?
Plenty of time.
Okay, so I just want to tell you about the mouse and the cherry blossoms. So that refers to an experiment that actually was run at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York. So now it refers to the whole field of epigenetics, which is this sort of burgeoning field of science. It's very anecdotal right now, but more and more researchers are looking into it. So epigenetics talks about how trauma can be passed down from generation to generation. And in the mouse and cherry blossom experiments, the researchers took a group of adult mice and they started exposing them to the smell of cherry blossoms, and then at the same time giving them an electric shock. So pairing these two sets of stimuli, the smell with the shock. And you might recognize that as classical Pavlovian conditioning, pairing of two stimuli. So eventually the adult mice, whenever they smelled the cherry blossoms, they would flinch and they would show fear because they were expecting the electric shock to come, at the same time. So that's Pavlovian conditioning, but the researchers then took the experiment one step further, and they took the offspring of the original test subjects, the original group of mice. Now, these baby mice had never seen their parents get an electric shock. They themselves had never gotten an electric shock. But when the researchers exposed them to the smell of cherry blossoms, lo and behold, the baby mice exhibited the exact same fear responses that their parents did. So the researchers took this to mean that trauma can be passed down through DNA, or almost as if a switch is flicked on in the DNA when it comes to this kind of trauma. And so I think that, that figures really prominently when we think about how children of parents who have been traumatized, not just Holocaust survivors, but of any kind of genocide, other traumas. So I thought that experiment was just fascinating, and definitely in my own life, I've met many other children of Holocaust survivors, and we definitely have a lot in common. We have all kinds of symptoms that we show that are, eerily similar. So I think there's a lot to say about this. And it's an interesting conversation when we talk about private school abuse, because, how do we deal with these victims later in life and what happens to their families? So Okay, I am going to wrap up what I wanted to say, except to please ask you that if you read either one of the books, if you would consider leaving a review on Amazon or Goodreads or both. It's so appreciated. It really helps authors, not just me, every author. If you read a book, leave a review. It really helps crank up the algorithms and get their work in front of more people's eyes. So, questions?